You've been told that Roman temples contained underground chambers for storing treasure and sacred relics, but the architectural evidence reveals something far more disturbing. These spaces were engineered specifically to eliminate sound, to create zones of absolute silence where what happened inside could never be heard outside, and the Romans built hundreds of them across their empire. Right now, beneath the ruins of temples from Baalbek to Bath, from Ephesus to North Africa, there are subterranean chambers with acoustic properties so precisely calculated that modern sound engineers study them in disbelief. These weren't storage rooms, they weren't crypts. They were deliberately designed isolation chambers, and when you examine who had access to them, who was taken into them, and what happened to Roman religious practice after Christianity banned their use, you start to understand why silence was so valuable to certain members of the priestly class that they built entire architectural systems to guarantee it. Here's what we know for certain. The Temple of Apollo at Didyma contains a massive underground chamber called the Didyma, accessed by two narrow corridors that descend at precise angles calculated to trap sound waves. Modern acoustic testing shows that even a scream produced inside that chamber becomes inaudible just 10 meters along the corridor. The walls are limestone blocks fitted so tightly that sound absorption reaches 98%, better than most modern recording studios. This wasn't accidental. Roman engineers understood acoustics with mathematical precision. They built amphitheaters where a whisper on stage could be heard in the upper rows. They created sounding vessels embedded in theater walls to amplify actors' voices. They knew exactly how to make sound travel, which means when they built chambers that eliminated sound entirely, they were making a deliberate choice. And you need to ask yourself, what activities require guaranteed silence? Listen carefully to what the architectural evidence reveals. At the Temple of Isis in Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash before anyone could alter it, there's a basement chamber accessed through a concealed door in the sanctuary floor. The chamber walls are covered with smooth stucco that redirects sound waves downward into sand-filled foundation trenches, a technique that creates what acoustic engineers call a dead room, a space where sound doesn't echo or carry. Inside this chamber, archaeologists found iron rings mounted to the walls at waist height and ankle height. The official explanation is that these were for tethering sacrificial animals. Read that again, animals. In a soundproofed underground room, beneath a temple dedicated to a goddess whose cult rituals specifically forbade animal sacrifice. The cognitive dissonance is staggering, but it's easier than asking what else those iron rings might have restrained. The literary sources are fragmentary and compromised. Roman writers who documented religious practices were almost exclusively from elite families, often themselves initiated into mystery cults, bound by oaths of secrecy that carried death penalties for violation. What survives is careful, coded language. Apuleius describes initiation into the Isis cult as descending to the boundaries of death, in a place of profound silence where even the gods cannot hear. Tertullian, writing as a Christian critic, claims mystery cult initiations involved experiences so traumatic that initiates emerged, transformed by terror. Clement of Alexandria hints at unmentionable acts performed in darkness and silence as part of Bacchic mysteries. These aren't detailed testimonies, they're fragments, clues. The kind of evidence you get when speaking directly is forbidden and the penalty for clarity is execution, but architecture doesn't lie. And the architecture is everywhere once you learn to recognize it. At the Mithraeum beneath San Clement in Rome, there's a chamber carved directly into bedrock with walls shaped in parabolic curves that focus sound inward, preventing any noise from escaping the room. At the Temple of Serapis in Alexandria, ancient descriptions mention chambers of silence, where initiates underwent trials of endurance. At Eleusis, site of the most famous mystery cult in the ancient world, the Telesterian building contained underground rooms with acoustic properties so effective that celebrations involving thousands of initiates above produced no audible sound in the chambers below. Why would you need soundproofed basement rooms during a public religious festival unless something happening in those rooms needed to be concealed from the crowds above? Now understand the social machinery that made this possible. Mystery cults weren't fringe religions. They were mainstream institutions attended by senators, generals, and emperors. Membership provided social status, business connections, and political advantages. Refusing initiation could damage your career prospects and social standing. And initiation required descending into those underground chambers, alone or in small groups, under the complete control of priests who held absolute authority within sacred precincts. Roman law granted temples legal sanctuary and gave priests jurisdiction over religious offenses. What happened inside temple grounds was outside civil authority. The silence wasn't just acoustic. It was legal, social, and enforced by the full weight of religious tradition. Read the initiation oaths that survive. They're chilling in their precision. Initiates swear by multiple gods never to reveal what is seen, what is heard, what is experienced during the mysteries, with specific clauses covering acts performed upon the body and endurance of pain for sacred purpose. The language is careful, legalistic, anticipating exactly what someone might want to report and preemptively binding them to silence about it. And the penalties for oath breaking weren't abstract divine punishment, they were concrete and immediate. Initiates who spoke were hunted down and killed. The murder of Alcibiades is the most famous case, but criminal court records from Athens and Rome document dozens of prosecutions for profaning the mysteries, trials that consistently ended in execution or exile. Here's where it gets truly disturbing. When you map the distribution of temples with soundproof chambers across the Roman Empire, they cluster in specific locations. Port cities, military garrison towns, and provincial capitals, places with transient populations, where young men far from home might disappear without anyone asking questions. And when you examine skeletal remains from temple complexes, you find anomalies. Beneath the Temple of Cybele on Palatine Hill, excavations in the 1960s uncovered juvenile remains showing healed fractures consistent with restraint injuries and pelvic damage. The official report classified them as possible evidence of ritual activity and moved on. No DNA analysis, no trauma assessment, no follow-up investigation. Just a brief mention in an excavation summary that's never been widely published. This is the part academic historians don't want to discuss, because the evidence is fragmentary and the implications are terrible, but silence itself is evidence. The acoustic engineering is evidence. The iron restraints are evidence. The initiation oaths are evidence. The clustered locations are evidence. And the complete absence of detailed accounts describing what actually happened in those chambers, in a civilization that documented everything from dinner parties to military campaigns with obsessive detail. That absence is perhaps the most damning evidence of all. Romans wrote about gladiatorial combat, public executions, sexual practices, political corruption, military atrocities. They wrote about everything except what happened during mystery cult initiations. That selective silence wasn't accidental. It was enforced. Consider what we know about trauma and testimony. Victims of severe trauma, especially trauma experienced in childhood or adolescence, often cannot speak about their experiences for decades or even lifetimes. When that trauma occurs within a religious context, backed by oath-binding rituals and supernatural threats, silence becomes even more absolute. When the legal system provides no recourse because temple grounds are outside civil jurisdiction, when your entire social network consists of people who underwent the same initiation and maintain the same silence, when speaking out means exile or death, under those conditions, testimony becomes impossible. And the machinery that perpetuates abuse can continue for centuries, protected by walls of enforced silence. Now notice what happened when Christianity gained power. One of the first acts of Christian emperors wasn't banning pagan worship broadly. It was specifically targeting mystery cults and ordering the destruction of their underground chambers. The Theodosian decrees of the 390 CE don't just forbid pagan sacrifice. They specifically mandate the filling in of subterranean chambers and the destruction of places of hidden ritual. Christian writers like Augustine explicitly condemn the unspeakable acts performed in darkness within pagan temples. Modern scholarship treats this as religious propaganda, Christian exaggeration of pagan immorality. But what if it wasn't exaggeration? What if early Christians, many of whom had been initiated into mystery cults before converting, knew exactly what happened in those chambers and were trying to eliminate the architectural infrastructure that made it possible? The evidence becomes even more compelling when you examine which temples were destroyed most thoroughly. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, wasn't just closed, it was systematically demolished, with particular attention paid to its underground chambers, which were filled with rubble and sealed. The Temple of Serapis in Alexandria was burned and its basement chambers collapsed intentionally. At Eleusis, Christian authorities didn't just ban the mysteries. They destroyed the Telesterian building entirely and built a church on top of the ruins. This wasn't normal religious suppression. This was targeted elimination of specific architectural spaces. They weren't just banning a religion, they were destroying the rooms, and the silence continued. Medieval Christian sources mention ancient pagan crimes, but never specify what those crimes were. Renaissance scholars studying classical religion simply repeated sanitized accounts of mystery cults as spiritual experiences and philosophical initiations. Enlightenment thinkers celebrated mystery cults as examples of ancient religious tolerance. Modern academics study them as interesting anthropological phenomena, focusing on mythology and symbolism, while carefully avoiding questions about what initiates actually experienced in those soundproofed underground chambers. The silence that Roman priests engineered acoustically has been maintained historically through scholarly avoidance. through treating the absence of testimony as evidence of nothing rather than evidence of suppression. But survivors leave traces even when they cannot speak. An initiate named Lucius, writing in coded language in a private letter discovered in Egypt, describes returning from Eleusinian mysteries changed in ways I cannot name and unable to forget what I must not speak. A graffito scratched into the wall of a Mithrium reads, "I endured what I should not have endured," quickly scraped away by someone else, but not before the plaster preserved its impression. A woman named Julia, in her will recorded in a legal archive, specifically requests that her sons never be initiated into the mysteries of Cybele, unusual enough that the notary recorded her reasoning, that they may be spared what their mother endured. These fragments exist. They're just scattered across thousands of documents, easy to miss unless you're looking for them, and most scholars aren't looking because the implications are too disturbing. Understand the long-term consequences. Mystery cults shaped Roman social structure for centuries. Senators, generals, and emperors were all initiates. The networks formed through shared initiation lasted lifetimes and crossed political boundaries. What happens to a society when its elite are bound together not just by shared privilege, but by shared trauma and enforced silence about that trauma? What happens when access to power requires undergoing experiences so damaging that victims spend their lives ensuring others undergo the same experiences, perpetuating cycles of abuse through generations? Rome didn't fall because of barbarian invasions or economic decline. Those were symptoms. Rome fell because its social elite had been systematically traumatized through religious institutions that normalized abuse as spiritual transformation, and traumatized people build traumatized systems. The definitive truth is this: Romans built chambers beneath temples specifically for silence, because what happened in those chambers needed to be concealed from witnesses, unheard by anyone outside, and protected from legal accountability. The acoustic engineering wasn't about creating sacred atmosphere. It was about guaranteeing that screams couldn't be heard. The initiation oaths weren't about protecting mystical secrets. They were about preventing testimony. The legal sanctuary granted to temples wasn't about religious freedom. It was about creating jurisdictional zones where abuse could occur without civil intervention. We inherited sanitized accounts of mystery cults as spiritual institutions, but the architecture tells a different story. One of systematic, institutionalized abuse protected by religious authority, enforced by elite social networks, and concealed by the most effective silencing mechanism ever devised: chambers engineered to eliminate sound itself. If this investigation into Rome's architecture of silence has shown you how physical spaces can be engineered to enable institutional abuse, how testimony can be prevented through architectural design, and how historical silence itself should be read as evidence rather than absence of evidence, then hit that subscribe button on Mythbusting. We're going to keep examining the uncomfortable truths that survive in stone and space, even when written testimony has been destroyed or suppressed. The most important historical questions are often the ones we've been trained not to ask. So what other architectural evidence should we investigate? What other patterns of institutional silence need to be broken? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation about how power uses space to perpetuate abuse is one that every generation needs to continue.